shy waitress secretly fed a quiet boy every day, unaware he was a grieving billionaire testing the world's kindness. "You do not belong here." The rain hammered down on the greasy diner window like 1,000 desperate fists, relentless and wild, each drop tracing a frantic path through the grime. Alara watched the deluge from behind the worn formica countertop, the relentless drumming a perfect echo of the anxiety thudding in her own chest, a frantic rhythm that had become the soundtrack to her weary life. She was a ghost in this small world of cracked vinyl and stale coffee, moving with a quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible, a skill she had perfected out of necessity. The biting cold of the evening seeped through the cracks in the window frame, a constant, unwelcome reminder of the threadbare coat waiting for her by the door, and the even colder apartment that awaited her after her shift, a place filled with the hollow echoes of a life that was no longer hers. She was gone. Her world had splintered into 1,000 fragile pieces the day she lost her parents, leaving her with nothing but a mountain of medical debt and a sacred, silver locket that felt heavier each day. She clutched it now, the cool metal a familiar anchor in the churning sea of her despair. Her fingers, pale and trembling slightly from exhaustion, traced the ornate etching, a subconscious prayer to the smiling faces sealed within. The diner was nearly empty, the flickering light from the neon sign outside casting long, dancing shadows across the floor, making the empty booths look like cavernous, waiting mouths. It was in these quiet moments, between wiping down sticky tables and refilling salt shakers, that the unbearable weight of her loneliness pressed down the hardest, threatening to shatter her dignified composure. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of old grease and burnt coffee, and forced her shoulders back. She had to keep going. There was no other choice. Mr. Henderson, the diner's owner, a man whose soul seemed as greasy as the grill he presided over, watched her from his perch by the cash register. His eyes, small and hard like polished river stones, missed nothing. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, the deep, weary shadows under her eyes, and he saw not a person struggling, but a liability. He saw weakness. He prided himself on running a tight ship, which was his euphemism for squeezing every last drop of labor from his staff for the lowest possible wage. He viewed kindness as a currency he did not trade in. "Alara," he barked, his voice a gravelly intrusion into the soft hush of the rainy night. "Table 4 needs a wipe down. Don't just stand there daydreaming. Time is money." Alara flinched, a barely perceptible motion, but her expression remained steady, a mask of quiet resolve she wore like armor. "Yes, Mr. Henderson," she murmured, her voice soft, almost carried away by the sound of the pounding rain. She picked up a damp cloth, the worn fabric rough against her skin, and moved towards the empty table. Her reflection in the dark window was a pale, shimmering ghost, a stranger with haunted eyes. She felt a profound disconnect from that image, from the girl who had once dreamed of being a painter, whose world was filled with color and light. Now her world was shades of gray, a relentless cycle of work and worry, of trying to keep her head above the dark, churning water of debt. The warmth of the diner felt like a lie, a temporary shield against the brutal cold of her reality. She knew this place was not a sanctuary. It was a cage, and Mr. Henderson was the keeper. He was a constant, grating presence, his impatience a physical force in the room. He would stand over her as she counted her meager tips, his shadow looming, as if to remind her that even these few crumpled bills were a gift from his magnanimous hand. She endured it all with an unwavering, dignified silence. It was the only thing she had left that was truly hers, her inner strength. The bell over the door chimed, a tinny, cheerful sound that was utterly at odds with the desolate night. A young man, or perhaps just a boy, stood dripping in the doorway, framed by the storm. He was soaked, his thin jacket plastered to his brittle frame, his dark hair slicked to his pale forehead. But it was his eyes that made Alara's heart clench. They were hollow, utterly vacant, as if the person behind them had long since departed, leaving only a fragile shell behind. He didn't move further into the diner, just stood there, a specter of misery, water pooling at his worn shoes. Mr. Henderson looked up, his face twisting into a mask of disgust. "We don't serve your kind here," he snapped, his voice sharp and cruel. "Get out before you track mud all over my floor." The boy didn't react, his gaze remaining fixed on some distant, unseen point. He seemed not to have heard or perhaps not to care. He was a statue carved from sorrow. Alara felt a surge of something fierce and protective, a feeling so foreign and powerful it made her gasp. She saw not a vagrant, but a reflection of her own shattered world, a kindred spirit in suffering. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice trembling but clear. "It's pouring." "He's not bothering anyone." Henderson turned his glare on her. "And you're not paid to think, Alara. You're paid to work. Tell him to leave or you can join him." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Alara's own desperation, the eviction notice she knew was coming, the gnawing hunger she often went to bed with. It all screamed at her to obey, to turn away, to survive. But then she looked back at the boy, at the sheer, desolate emptiness in his eyes, and she knew she couldn't. It was a line she would not cross. Her own hardship had not hardened her heart. It had made it more tender, more raw. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the boy, a silent message of apology, and watched as he turned and vanished back into the relentless, hammering rain. The door clicked shut, leaving behind only a small puddle on the linoleum. A testament. That night, Alara couldn't sleep. The image of the boy's haunted eyes was seared into her mind. The plate of leftovers Mr. Henderson had begrudgingly allowed her to take home, her only meal for the day, sat untouched on her small, rickety table. The single flickering light bulb in her apartment cast long, menacing shadows on the peeling walls. Every creak of the old building, every distant siren, seemed to amplify her profound sense of isolation. She thought of the boy, out in that biting cold, soaked and alone. She knew that feeling. It was a cold that seeped deeper than the skin, a cold that settled in your bones and whispered that you were utterly, irrevocably alone. A sob caught in her throat, a raw, painful sound in the sterile silence of her room. She wouldn't let it break her. She couldn't. The next day, she went to work with a new, quiet resolve. She watched the alley behind the diner, her heart pounding with a strange mix of hope and fear. And then she saw him. He was huddled against the brick wall, trying to find shelter from the wind under a meager overhang, his thin shoulders shaking. He looked even more fragile in the harsh light of day. For the rest of her shift, Alara worked with a secret purpose. She made sure an extra portion of soup was ladled into a container, that a side of bread was wrapped in a napkin. It was food that would be thrown out anyway, she reasoned, but her hands still trembled as she slipped the small package into her apron pocket. It felt like a monumental theft, a betrayal of the cruel rules that governed her world. It was her own portion, the meal she was supposed to take. The personal cost was a sharp pang of hunger she knew she would feel later. She didn't care. When her shift ended, she didn't leave through the front door. She slipped out the back, her heart thudding wildly against her ribs. The alley was cold and damp, smelling of garbage and rain. The boy was still there, his head bowed, his face hidden in the shadows. He looked up as she approached, his hollow eyes wary, like a startled animal. Alara's courage faltered for a second. What was she even doing? But the inherent goodness within her, the pure, selfless part of her that her parents had nurtured, pushed her forward. She held out the container. This was extra," she stammered, the lie feeling clumsy on her tongue. "It was just going to be thrown away." He didn't move. He just stared at the offering, then at her face, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. It was a moment of stunned silence, a profound, unspoken exchange that seemed to stretch for an eternity. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the dim, grimy alley. Gently, she placed the container on the ground near him, along with a plastic fork she had grabbed. "Please," she whispered. "Eat." She backed away slowly, not wanting to frighten him, her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than pity. It was a deep, seismic connection, a recognition of shared pain. As she reached the end of the alley, she glanced back. He hadn't moved, but his eyes were following her, and for the first time, she thought she saw not emptiness, but a glimmer of something else. A question, a spark. She didn't know it yet, but this simple, unsolicited act of kindness would change everything. It was a lifeline thrown into a deep, dark abyss, and someone, against all odds, was about to catch it. She hurried home, the gnawing in her stomach a small price to pay for the strange warmth spreading through her chest. It was the first time she had felt anything other than despair in a very long time. A flicker of hope. This became their sacred ritual. Every day, Alara would save a portion of her own meal or find a way to squirrel away leftovers destined for the trash. Her movements deft and secret. Every evening, she would slip out the back door and leave the small offering for the silent boy in the alley. He was always there, waiting, a quiet, constant presence in her tumultuous life. They never spoke. Words seemed unnecessary, intrusive. Their communication was in the gentle way she placed the food down, in the almost imperceptible nod he would give in return. Sometimes their eyes would meet for a brief, charged moment, and in that shared glance, a universe of unspoken understanding passed between them. She learned the subtle shifts in his posture. The way his shoulders were less hunched on days he seemed less lost, the slight easing of the tension in his jaw. She started bringing other small things. An old, worn blanket she found at a thrift store, which she left folded neatly on a dry crate. A cheap flashlight for the dark nights. Each item was a sacrifice. A few dollars she desperately needed for her bills. But the act of giving filled a hollow part of her that money never could. It gave her purpose beyond mere survival. It felt like she was not just feeding him, but feeding the last vestiges of her own hope, keeping it alive in the face of overwhelming odds. He was her secret, her responsibility, and in a strange way, her salvation. He anchored her to the world, reminding her that even in the deepest darkness, a single act of gentleness could create a pinprick of light. The narration of her own life began to change. It was no longer just a story of loss and hardship, but a story of this quiet, tender connection. A story of two lost souls finding a moment of grace in a forgotten alley. From the boy's perspective, a world away from what Alara could ever imagine. These moments were nothing short of miraculous. Julian Croft had intentionally cast himself into the abyss. After the accident that had claimed his wife, Amelia, and his 5-year-old son, Leo, his multi-billion-dollar empire felt like a monument to ash. The gleaming boardrooms, the crisp reports, the endless parade of deferential employees. It all became unbearable. The world was a transactional, cynical place, and he had been its king. He blamed that world, and himself, for being too busy, too powerful, too distracted to prevent the one thing that mattered. So he had vanished. He shed his bespoke suits for threadbare clothes, his polished shoes for worn-out sneakers. He wanted to feel the raw, unfiltered truth of the world he now despised. He was conducting a cruel experiment, testing the very nature of humanity. He wanted proof that the world was as dark and selfish as his grief told him it was. And for weeks it had proven him right. People looked through him, recoiled from him, cursed at him. He was invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a society that had once celebrated his name. He was starving not just for food, but for a sign, any sign, that a pure, selfless impulse still existed. And then he found it, in the form of a shy waitress with haunted eyes of her own. The first time she brought him food, the warmth from the container seeping into his cold hands, it was a seismic shock to his system. It wasn't pity in her eyes. It was empathy, a sincere, undeniable connection. She wasn't giving from a place of abundance. He could see the weariness in her frame, the worn fabric of her uniform. He knew, with an instinct sharpened by years of reading people in boardrooms, that she was giving him something she could not afford to lose. It was a selfless act of pure, unadulterated kindness. It was the sign he had been searching for. The blanket, the flashlight, each offering was a stitch, mending a tear in the fabric of his shattered soul. He started to watch her through the dirty diner window, observing her quiet dignity, the gentle way she treated even the rudest customers, the iron resolve beneath her fragile exterior. She was reawakening his heart, giving him a new, unexpected purpose. His experiment was over. He had found his answer. His new purpose was to find a way to repay this incredible, innocent kindness, to shield this small flame of goodness from the harsh winds of the world. He just didn't know how yet. His old life of power and wealth felt like a blunt, clumsy instrument, unworthy of the delicate, sacred gift she had given him. He had to be careful. He had to wait for the right moment. The wait was unbearable. The fragile bubble of their secret world was destined to burst. Mr. Henderson, with his keen eye for profit and loss, had noticed the discrepancies. A little extra soup here, a side of toast there, it added up. In his mind, it wasn't waste being salvaged. It was theft. It was money being stolen directly from his pocket. His suspicion fell on Alara, the quiet one. He started watching her on the small, grainy security monitor he kept in his office. His lips curled into a permanent sneer. He saw her slip out the back door, her movements furtive. He saw the exchange, the container pass to the shadowy figure in the alley. Rage, cold and sharp, coiled in his gut, not just for the stolen food, but for the audacity of it, the secret she kept from him, the kindness he saw as a profound weakness and an insult to his authority. He decided to make an example of her. He waited for the perfect moment, a lull in the late afternoon rush, when there were just enough customers to serve as an audience for his cruelty, but not so many that it would disrupt business. Alara was wiping down the counter, her movements slow and weary. The relentless pace of her life was catching up to her, the lack of food and sleep etching new lines of fatigue onto her pale face. Alara! Mr. Henderson's voice boomed, making her jump. He stormed out from behind the register, a look of triumph on his face. He was holding a handful of receipts. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "I've been wondering where my profits have been going." Alara froze, the damp cloth clutched in her hand. Her heart began to pound a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She knew what was coming. A few customers looked up from their meals, their curiosity piqued. "You've been stealing from me?" he accused, throwing the receipts onto the counter. "Giving my food away to that filth in the alley." Alara's face went white. The public humiliation was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She couldn't speak, could only stand there, trembling, as the eyes of strangers bored into her. She felt stripped bare, her one small act of goodness twisted into something ugly and criminal. It was leftovers," she finally managed to whisper, her voice a fragile thread. "It was going to be thrown out." "Liar!" Henderson roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "It's my food until I say it's garbage. You are a thief, and I will not have a thief working in my establishment." He pointed a thick, trembling finger toward the door. "You're fired. Get your things and get out." Now the words echoed in the sudden, sterile silence of the diner. The customers stared, some with pity, others with detached interest. No one said a word in her defense. In that moment, Alara felt more alone than ever before. Humiliation washed over her in a hot, sickening wave. With as much dignity as she could muster, she untied her apron, the familiar, worn fabric feeling alien in her hands. She placed it on the counter, her movements stiff and robotic. She didn't look at Mr. Henderson. She couldn't. She turned and walked towards the door, her back straight, her head held high, even as she felt her entire world collapsing around her. She was shattered. As she pushed the door open, the little bell chimed its mocking, cheerful tune. The cold air hit her face, a brutal shock. Her first thought was of the boy. She had to tell him. She had to let him know she couldn't bring food anymore. She hurried to the back, her steps frantic, her vision blurred by tears she refused to let fall. She rounded the corner into the alley, her breath catching in a sob. "I'm so sorry," she began, the words tumbling out. But she was speaking to no one. The alley was empty. The space where he always sat was bare. Even the worn blanket she had given him was gone. The crate underneath it stark and clean. A profound, gut-wrenching sense of loss overwhelmed her. She had lost her job, her dignity, and her one silent, meaningful connection, all in the span of a few brutal minutes. Total silence. The days that followed were a descent into a quiet, dignified desperation. Alara searched for work relentlessly, her worn shoes treading miles of unforgiving pavement. She walked into every restaurant, every cafe, every shop with a help-wanted sign, only to be met with polite refusals or promises of calls that never came. Her meager savings, already stretched to a threadbare limit, vanished with terrifying speed. The city, once a place of anonymous solace, now felt like a hostile entity, its towering buildings casting long shadows of judgment. The gnawing hunger in her stomach became a constant companion, a dull ache that mirrored the hollow ache in her heart. She missed the boy with an intensity that surprised her. She would find herself glancing down alleys as she walked, a foolish, desperate hope fluttering in her chest, only to be met with emptiness. The silence in her small apartment grew heavier, more oppressive. It was no longer a sanctuary, but a cell where her anxieties circled like vultures. Then came the slip of paper she had been dreading. The eviction notice, taped to her door, its stark, official letters a death sentence for her fragile stability. The words blurred before her eyes. She had 14 days. 14 days to produce a sum of money that felt as unattainable as the moon. The biting cold of fear, sharp and paralyzing, sank its teeth into her. She sat on her lumpy mattress, the notice clutched in her hand, the paper crinkling with the force of her trembling grip. For the first time, she truly believed she had nothing left. She had been strong for so long, had faced every hardship with quiet resolve, but this felt different. This felt like the end. She was going to be homeless, another ghost on the streets, just like the boy she had tried to help. The irony was a bitter pill. Her one act of selfless kindness had cost her everything. On the 13th day, when hope had all but withered and died, she returned to her apartment after another fruitless day of job, searching to find a plain white envelope slipped under her door. There was no name, no return address. Her heart pounded with a new kind of fear. Was it another warning from the landlord? With trembling fingers, she tore it open. Inside was not a letter, but a single, crisp piece of paper. It was a cashier's check. She stared at it, her mind struggling to comprehend. The amount written on the check was for 3 months' rent, a sum so astronomical to her it might as well have been $1 million. There was no note, no explanation, just the stark, undeniable reality of the check in her hand. Disbelief gave way to a wave of dizzying, tearful relief. She sank to the floor, a sob of pure, cathartic release shaking her entire body. Who would do this? Why? She went to the bank the next morning, half convinced it was a mistake, a cruel prank. But the teller confirmed it was real, drawn from a corporate holding account with an unpronounceable name. They could tell her nothing more. The mystery was unsettling, but the security it provided was a lifeline. 2 days later, her phone rang, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. She answered hesitantly. A warm, professional voice on the other end introduced herself as being from a new cafe opening downtown, a place called the Amber Kettle. They had received her resume, she was told, and were incredibly impressed. They wanted to interview her for the position of manager. Alara was stunned into silence. She hadn't applied for any manager position. She hadn't even heard of the Amber Kettle. "I think you have the wrong person," she stammered. "No, Ms. Vance," the voice insisted gently. "We were told you were the best, that you were highly recommended. Can you come in tomorrow?" Miles away, in a cavernous office at the top of a gleaming skyscraper, Julian Croft ended a call with his personal assistant, Arthur. The office was a study in minimalist power. Polished marble floors, a vast mahogany desk, and a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a commanding view of the city he owned. He was wearing an impeccable, tailor-made suit, a stark contrast to the threadbare jacket he had worn just days before. The hollow look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, commanding focus. But a deep sadness still lingered in their depths, a shadow that wealth could not erase. "Is it done, Arthur?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "The rent has been paid anonymously, sir. The funds are untraceable to you," Arthur replied, his own voice the epitome of crisp efficiency. "And the commercial space on Elm Street has been acquired. The build-out for the Amber Kettle begins today. The interview with Ms. Vance is scheduled for tomorrow morning." Julian nodded, turning to look out at the city below. He saw not a landscape of opportunity, but a collection of dark alleys and cold street corners. "And Henderson?" he asked, his voice hardening. "What have you found?" "Martin Henderson," Arthur read from a tablet. "Multiple health code violations over the years, all settled with minimal fines. High staff turnover. Numerous complaints of wage theft, none of which have ever been formally pursued. He's a small-time tyrant." Sir Julian's jaw clenched. A muscle twitched. "Keep a file on him. I want to know everything." He dismissed Arthur with a wave of his hand. Alone, he walked over to his desk and picked up a small, framed photograph. It was a grainy image, taken from a high-angle security camera he'd had installed in the alley after the first night. It showed Alara, her face filled with a gentle concern, placing a container of food on the ground. To anyone else, it was a meaningless, blurry photo. To Julian, it was the most precious object he owned. It was a picture of the moment his world shifted on its axis. His profound grief had not vanished, but it had found a new channel. It was no longer a destructive force, but a protective one. He would build a fortress around this woman's goodness. He would create a world for her where her kindness would be rewarded, not punished. The Amber Kettle was just the beginning. It was his quiet, secret intervention, a way to repay his debt without revealing the clumsy, broken man she had saved. He owed her a world of warmth and light. He would build it for her, brick by brick. He was terrified. Alara walked into the Amber Kettle feeling as though she had stepped into another dimension. The air inside was warm and smelled of freshly ground coffee beans, cinnamon, and baking bread. Sunlight streamed through the large, clean windows, illuminating the polished oak floors and catching the golden glow of the amber-hued lamps that hung from the ceiling. It was the physical embodiment of warmth and safety, a stark, almost painful contrast to the greasy spoon diner that had been her prison. Her worn-out shoes felt clumsy and loud on the gleaming floor. She clutched her purse, her palms sweating, feeling entirely out of place. A smiling woman greeted her and led her to a small table in the back where a man was sitting, his back to her. "Ms. Vance," the woman said brightly. "This is Mr. Croft, the owner." The man stood and turned. Alara froze. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the face from the alley, yet it wasn't. The hollow, haunted look was gone. The gauntness filled out. His dark hair was expertly cut, his jaw clean-shaven. He was dressed in a crisp, dark sweater and tailored trousers, radiating an aura of quiet confidence and power. The eyes were the same, though deep and intense, and at this moment, filled with a gentle warmth that made her heart skip a beat. She did not recognize him as the boy. She saw only a handsome, commanding stranger who was inexplicably looking at her as if he already knew her. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice a smooth, low baritone that was nothing like the silence she remembered. "Thank you for coming. I'm Julian Croft." He extended a hand. She took it automatically, her own hand trembling inside his warm, firm grip. He knew she didn't recognize him, and a part of him was relieved. He wasn't ready to bridge the chasm between the man he was and the ghost he had been. "Not yet. I was the one who recommended you," he explained, gesturing for her to sit. "I was a customer at your old place of work a few times. I was always impressed by your grace under pressure. Your kindness." The lie was smooth, plausible. It calmed the frantic beating of her heart. The interview was a blur. He asked her questions not about profit margins or inventory management, but about what made a place feel like home, what she would do to create a sanctuary for people. He listened with an unwavering, steady intensity that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. By the end, he offered her the job. Not as a waitress, but as the general manager with a salary that made her gasp. She accepted, her mind reeling in disbelief. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity as they prepared for the grand opening. Alara threw herself into the work, her natural diligence and quiet competence blooming in this new, supportive environment. She and Julian worked side by side, their initial formality slowly melting away into a comfortable, easy partnership. They would often stay late, long after the contractors and staff had gone home, poring over menus or arranging furniture. It was in these quiet, dimly lit hours that their true connection began to form. One night, as they sat sharing a pot of tea amidst the scent of fresh paint and sawdust, a comfortable silence settled between them. Alara found herself tracing the rim of her teacup, her mother's locket cool against her skin. Julian noticed the gesture. "That's a beautiful locket," he said softly. "It was my mother's," Alara replied, her voice thick with unspoken emotion. And then, the story just poured out of her. The story of her parents, their long illness, the crushing weight of the debt they left behind, her dream of one day owning a small place that felt as warm and welcoming as her mother's kitchen had been. She spoke of her loneliness, of the feeling of being a ghost in her own life. Julian listened, his eyes never leaving her face. He didn't offer empty platitudes or trite reassurances. He simply listened, his presence a solid, comforting anchor. When she finished, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, he reached across the table and refilled her cup, his hand steady. The simple, gentle gesture spoke volumes. Then he began to speak, his own voice low and raw with a pain that was still fresh. He told her about Amelia and Leo. He spoke of the accident, the sterile silence of the hospital, the cavernous emptiness of his stately home. He confessed how he had lost himself in grief, how he had walked away from his life, wanting to disappear, to become nothing. He described wandering the streets, a ghost of a different kind, convinced the world was a cold, transactional place devoid of genuine goodness. "I was testing the world," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I wanted it to prove me right. I wanted a reason to give up completely." He paused, taking a shaky breath, his gaze meeting hers. "And then," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "someone left me a plate of warm food in a cold alley." The world stopped. The air splintered. Alara's teacup clattered against its saucer. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. Her mind raced, connecting the impossible dots. The haunted eyes, the sudden disappearance, the anonymous rent check, this miraculous job. It was him. It had always been him. Her heart thudded in her chest, a wild, frantic drumbeat. He saw the realization dawn in her eyes, the disbelief warring with a profound, dawning understanding. He had not planned to tell her, not like this, but in the sacred intimacy of their shared confessions, the truth had demanded to be spoken. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He simply sat with her in the heavy, cathartic silence, a bond of shared grief and unspoken gratitude forging itself between them, stronger and more unbreakable than steel. He was saved. The grand opening of the Amber Kettle was a resounding success. The cafe was filled to bursting, the air buzzing with cheerful conversation and the clinking of porcelain. A golden glow from the carefully chosen lighting bathed everything in a warm, inviting hue. Alara moved through the crowd, a genuine, radiant smile on her face. She was no longer a ghost. She was the heart of this beautiful place, greeting customers, directing staff, her confidence a quiet, steady flame. For the first time, she felt a sense of belonging, of security. She felt happy. Julian watched her from a quiet corner, his heart swelling with a tender, protective emotion that felt terrifyingly like love. Seeing her thrive, seeing her goodness finally being celebrated, was the most profound reward he could ever have imagined. But the past has a way of casting long shadows. The cheerful chime of the front door was followed by a jarring, angry voice that cut through the happy din. "I should have known." Alara froze. She knew that voice. It was the sound of her humiliation, the echo of her deepest despair. Mr. Henderson stood in the doorway, his face a mask of purple rage. His own diner, just a few blocks away, was nearly empty, the lunchtime rush having abandoned him for this new, popular spot. He saw Ilara, not as a victim of his cruelty, but as the architect of his failure. Jealousy and resentment had curdled into a vicious, public attack. He stomped into the center of the cafe, his presence a vulgar intrusion into the serene atmosphere. "You!" he roared, pointing a shaking finger at Ilara. The entire cafe fell silent. "A thief! Running a place like this! Where did you get the money? Huh? Did you steal this, too?" Ilara stood rooted to the spot, the color draining from her face. The warmth of the room turned into a biting cold. She was back in the diner, a helpless target of his venom. The eyes of all her new, happy customers were on her, their expressions shifting from surprise to suspicion. She could feel her carefully constructed new life beginning to tremble, to crack. But this time was different. She was no longer the same fragile girl. She lifted her chin, her eyes, though shimmering with unshed tears, were steady and unflinching. "You should leave, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying across the now silent room. Her dignity was her shield, and it held. "Leave?" he sneered, taking a step closer. "I'm not going anywhere until everyone in here knows what you are. You're nothing but a piece of trash who gives handouts to other trash." He was leaning in now, his voice a venomous hiss, his face contorted with ugly triumph. He was enjoying this, feeding on her public pain. Just as he opened his mouth to unleash another tirade, the soft click of the front door opening was barely audible, but its effect was immediate. The atmosphere in the room shifted, charged with a new, commanding energy. Outside, 5 gleaming black SUVs had pulled up to the curb in a silent, impressive procession. Julian Croft stepped out of the lead vehicle. He walked into the cafe, not with anger, but with a preternatural calm that was far more intimidating. He moved with the effortless authority of a man who was used to bending the world to his will. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. He stopped beside Ilara, a silent, solid pillar of support. He didn't even look at her. His cool, unwavering gaze was fixed entirely on the sputtering diner owner. "Mr. Henderson." Julian's voice was quiet, yet it echoed in the sterile silence, each word landing with the weight of polished marble. "My name is Julian Croft. I am the owner of Croft Enterprises, and the sole proprietor of this establishment." A collective gasp went through the room. Henderson's jaw dropped, his face paling. "And more importantly," Julian continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intense, "I was the filth in the alley you spoke of. I was the trash this kind, decent woman chose to feed, not with stolen food, but with the meal she was meant to take for herself." He took a step forward, and Henderson instinctively took a step back. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been utterly and irrevocably reversed. She gave selflessly when she had nothing. You, on the other hand, are a man who takes spitefully when you have everything. You punish kindness because you are incapable of understanding it. Julian's monologue was delivered without a trace of overt anger, but with a cold, precise fury that was far more devastating. "This cafe," he said, gesturing to the beautiful room, "is not a business venture for me. It is a gift. It is a small, inadequate repayment for an act of pure, selfless humanity that reminded me what it was to be alive." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He looked directly at Henderson, his eyes like chips of ice. "I find your business practices and your character to be reprehensible. Which is why, as of 9 o'clock this morning, a subsidiary of my company completed the acquisition of Henderson's Diner." "Your diner?" Henderson stared, speechless, his face a mixture of confusion and terror. "Consider this your official notice," Julian finished, his voice utterly flat. "You are fired. My legal team will be in contact with you regarding the multiple wage theft complaints from your former employees, which I will be personally funding. Now, get out of my cafe." Henderson splintered. He stumbled backward, his face ashen, his bravado completely gone. replaced by the pathetic, shattered look of a bully who had finally met an immovable force. He turned and fled, practically running from the cafe, disappearing from their lives forever. For a long moment after he was gone, the cafe remained in a state of stunned silence. Then one person began to clap. A slow, deliberate sound. Another joined in, and then another, until the entire room erupted in spontaneous, heartfelt applause. It wasn't just for the drama. It was for her. For Alara. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. A wobbly, cathartic, beautiful smile. The customers, strangers just moments before, were looking at her with open admiration and respect. The cloud of humiliation had been obliterated, replaced by a golden glow of vindication. Julian waited until the applause subsided, then turned to face her. The commanding CEO vanished, replaced by the man who had shared his deepest grief with her over a pot of tea. His eyes were raw, tender, and filled with an unspoken emotion that made her breath catch. He gently reached out and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. "Alara," he said, his voice for her alone, a soft, intimate murmur in the quieted room. "When I was lost in the dark, you were the only light I could see. You didn't just give me food to survive. You gave me a reason to want to survive. You showed me how to live again, how to feel again." He took both of her hands in his grip gentle but firm. "I know this is sudden, and the world I come from is complicated and so different from yours, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I think I'm falling in love with you." The confession hung in the air between them, simple, sincere, and undeniable. Alara looked into his eyes, the eyes she had first seen filled with emptiness and now saw filled with love for her, and felt her own heart overflow. The quiet boy from the alley and the powerful billionaire were the same person. Two halves of a man who had seen her, truly seen her, at her lowest and her best. "I think I am too," she whispered, her voice steady and clear. And in that quiet, sacred moment, surrounded by the warmth of the life he had built for her, two shattered souls finally, completely, became whole. 1 year later, the biting cold of the city seemed a distant memory, replaced by the gentle warmth of an autumn afternoon. Alara and Julian stood side by side, not in a cafe, but in front of a newly renovated brick building. The old, greasy sign for Henderson's Diner was gone, replaced by a simple, elegant one that read, "The Hearth Foundation." It was their shared project, their shared passion. A place that offered warm meals, temporary shelter, and job training for those who, like them, had known the cold sting of desperation. They were holding hands, their fingers laced together in a comfortable, familiar way. Laughter came easily to them now, a constant, gentle melody in the symphony of their new life. Alara was no longer the pale, trembling girl from the diner. She was radiant, her eyes bright with purpose and love. The silver locket her mother had given her still rested against her collarbone, a reminder of where she came from. But beside it now lay a simple, elegant diamond necklace, a promise of where she was going. Julian watched her as she spoke with one of the volunteers, his expression one of profound, quiet adoration. The haunted look was gone forever, replaced by a deep, settled peace. Their stately home was beautiful, their life comfortable beyond her wildest dreams. But this was their true joy. This was the real work. It was the legacy of a simple, selfless act of kindness performed in a dark alley, a ripple that had become a tidal wave of positive change. They had taken their shared pain and transformed it into a beacon of hope for others. Their love story wasn't just about a rich man saving a poor girl. It was about two people saving each other, and then turning that salvation outward to heal a small corner of the world. This story is a testament to the quiet power of a single, selfless act. It reminds us that behind every stranger's eyes lies a universe of unspoken pain and unseen struggle, and sometimes, the simplest offering of kindness. A warm meal, a gentle word, a moment of being seen, can be the very thing that saves a life. Alara's gentleness was not a weakness but a profound strength, a light that shone so brightly it could pierce even the deepest darkness of Julian's grief and cynicism. Their journey shows that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in the capacity of the human heart to give without expectation of reward. If this story touched your heart and reaffirmed your faith in the goodness of people, we hope you'll carry its message with you. In a world that can often feel cold and transactional, remember the power you hold to be a source of warmth and light for someone else. You may never know the full impact of your kindness, but as Alara and Julian's story shows, it can change the world for at least one person, and sometimes that is more than enough. For more soul-stirring tales of love, redemption, and the incredible power of human connection, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales. Your support allows us to continue bringing these inspiring stories to light, reminding us all that hope can be found in the most unexpected of places. We'll see you in the next one.